Hi guys, I can see you guys. I'm trying to figure out my phone and this is nice to see you guys. It's nice to be here.
Was that Alu? Hi.
That's Alu. Hi, Alu.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for joining.
You're welcome. I'm still trying to connect my system. I'm having some network challenges, but I will pop up soon.
We've purposely chosen a Zoom meeting rather than a Zoom webinar so that, you know, and there's opportunity for each other to interact in case, you know, we want to ask presenters questions and so on. So today's MC is Jody. I'll just pass it back to you. I'll shut up.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. Welcome to Rise Travel Institute's very first student conference. We're really excited to kick things off. I'm going to invite everyone to share where they're calling in from in the chat so we can see where people are. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you're not speaking, please keep your microphone on mute so that we can hear the presenters as they're talking and sharing their projects. Additionally, we learned recently from our friends at Crest that having your video off during a meeting on Zoom actually cuts down your carbon footprint for a virtual event by 96%, which is kind of crazy. And I think we don't always think about the carbon footprint something has when we're not moving. So I would invite you to save your carbon footprint and turn off your video if you're not presenting. Lastly, there will be an opportunity for questions for each presenter. So throw your questions in the chat and we'll do our best to get to all of them as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Hesse, who is one of our board members. Take it away.
Thank you, Jody. That's interesting news about the carbon footprint of Zoom cameras. I'm a little bit overwhelmed. I'm teaching environmental studies here in Tokyo, and I insist on my students always keeping their video on so they're engaged. So I guess if I want to really engage, I have to tell them to turn their videos off. I'm in trouble now. All right. Thank you so much, Jody. Thank you, Vinci. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the 2021 Rise Travel Institute Student Conference. I'm so happy to be here. I'm calling in from Tokyo, where I teach, and I'm a professor of law and environmental studies here. So my carbon footprint is often on my mind. And I am a board member of the Rise Institute. And I've been with Rise for about a year now and watched this amazing team. You're seeing many of them here now, but watch them come together and create this pilot program and bring in some excellent instructors under the direction of our executive director, Dr. Vinci Ho. So thank you all so much. It's wonderful to finally be seeing these capstone projects. We've been waiting since we first conceived of the idea of having capstone projects, and today it's coming to fruition. And thank you so much, those of you who have gone through the study process and created the capstones. And are ready to share your learning and your talent with us today. Just want to say that the success of this program, this pilot program, really is a testament to the diversity and talent and dedication of the RISE staff and the instructors who taught this summer. So thank you all so much. And especially congratulations to all of you who have graduated and who are presenting today and who have done a huge amount of work. These presentations are really outstanding, and from what I've seen of the details, and I'm really looking forward to hearing and seeing what you have to offer today. So with no more chat, I will turn it back over to Jody, and congratulations to everyone, and please enjoy. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I'm actually going to turn it over to Vincy now.
Hey, can you hear me? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Jody, and thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone. My name is Vincy Ho. I am the founder and executive director of RISE Travel Institute. Welcome to our very first student conference. So for those who are not familiar with RISE Travel Institute, I'm going to share just a couple of slides. Give me 1 second. Right, so for those who are not familiar with RISE Travel Institute, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization established in June 2020 with a mission to inspire responsible, impactful, sustainable, and ethical travel through education. We started with a team of 3 people, and we have rapidly grown into a team of 43 incredibly talented volunteers, 5 on the board, 8 on our advisory council, and most importantly, 30 dedicated professionals on our operations team. And our main programs consist of an online curriculum. This summer, we ran our first 10-week-long pilot program, and we'll continue to expand our curriculum in the years to come. And several courses are already in the pipeline for 2022, which I'm going to share a little more towards the end of the conference today. So I hope you'll stay until the very end. We also have what we call experiential journeys for our students to put theory into practice. There'll be 1 to 2 experiential journeys per year when it's absolutely safe to travel again. So today, forgot my slides. All right, so today our pilot program students will be presenting their capstone projects. But what is our pilot program? Our pilot program took place this past summer, and there were altogether 14 instructors who helped put together this amazing program in sustainable travel and anti-oppression. So at our first cohort of students, we have over 60 students from Asia, Africa, Europe, Central America, and North America, pretty much all over the world. And we have given away 5 tuition grants to students so that they can, college students, so that they can study with us for free. And we also have, among the 60 students, the Capstone Project is optional, but it is a requirement for the Certificate in Sustainability and Anti-Oppression in Travel. And 18 students decided to go for it, and 12 of them are going to present at today's conference. So at RISE Travel Institute, our educational approach emphasizes a lot on looking at the interconnectedness of all issues in relation to travel, including social justice, animal and wildlife protection, and the protection of biodiversity, conservation of biodiversity, and environmental justice and sustainability. Our aim is to foster a deep and holistic understanding of sustainability, our relationship with the world, and identify the cycles of oppression present in the travel space and how they interact, and develop systems thinking and critical thinking skills necessary to become a mindful traveler, and thereby supporting a more regenerative future for humanity and the planet. So these are the main themes covered in our pilot program. And if you are interested in knowing more about the details of what we learn in each of these sessions, you can find the detailed course descriptions on our website, and as well as instructor information. Our website is simply risetravelinstitute.org. So without further ado, I'll pass it back to Jody to introduce our first student presenter. Good luck, everyone.
Thanks, Vinci.
Thank you.
We are going to start with our student presentations. Our presenters will answer questions at the end of their presentations, so put your questions in the chat. We're going to do our best to get to all of them, but if we don't have time to answer everyone's questions, we encourage you to connect with the students on LinkedIn to continue the conversation. Additionally, just a reminder, presenters, if you could please try to stick to your allotted time. We want to make sure that we get to everyone and everyone has a chance to present. So without further ado, our first presenter, Patricia Ward, is a wellness coach, and she's a certified travel coach with a background in disability services, social work, and career coaching. Patricia will be presenting on Indigenous tourism as part of reconciliation. So Patricia, take it away.
All right, so I'm just going to share my screen here. Do I have the, okay, good. I'm just going to do this. Okay. Can you see that?
Yep, you're good.
Yes.
Okay. So I chose sustainable Indigenous tourism and active reconciliation because right now in Canada, just on Thursday, we celebrated our first national holiday for the Truth and Reconciliation. So it's been a huge movement in Canada. I'm also a social worker and 70% of my clients are Indigenous. So it's really important to me. I myself am not Indigenous, but very much an ally and very much in the community. Sometimes I'm the only person that's not Indigenous in the room. So I have a real heart and I see the effects of this every day. So if I can bring that into my tourism, into my business, that's exciting for me. So I just wanted to look a bit at the TRC recommendations, and what that is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So several years back, the federal government paid for Canada to, and everybody told their stories about the 60s scoop out of the residential school history. And out of that came a bunch of recommendations to put forward for Canada to kind of acknowledge the past in a factual way and to repair moving forward. So the Indigenous tourism model that came out of this article that inspired my project saw the tourists as visitors welcome into the operator's country to share information and learn about others. And it's radically different from the mainstream view of tourism as an industry. So typically Indigenous communities, they have to sacrifice a lot of their authenticity in order to make it more touristy. And this kind of tourism really looks about it being more about hospitality and connection than profit and touristy. And the reconciliation occurs because we are sharing and sustaining true, authentic Indigenous culture, as well we're sharing their desired vision for the future. It also focuses on sustainability and environmentalism and the real Indigenous model where they really are connected to the earth and care for the earth. And its basis is really in that traditional language. And so the Truth and Reconciliation, when that came out, it really looked at recognizing rights, being like transparent politically and motivations for things, honoring really Indigenous ways of knowing and really repairing the relationship, and really that factual history and acknowledgement of what happened, and really teaching about sustainability, addressing issues, and really looking at the contributions of Indigenous people in Canada. And I did 2 research studies, but I only chose to focus on one here, just for time-wise. So I kind of had an article out of Australia, and Australia tends to be a little bit of ahead in their Indigenous research than Canada, so I feel like they're a little bit ahead of us that way. And the goal of this study was to empower Indigenous tourism operators in relation to knowledge and knowing. So it saw the Indigenous tour operators taking on the role as a teacher and as knowledge holders. So it encouraged that connection between the guests who came to the Indigenous community and them learning from the Indigenous tour operators, in the hope that would start to shift their beliefs about Indigenous people, not seeing them as needy and that stereotypical view where they need outsiders to come in, but rather that they have this whole vast knowledge that they can actually teach outsiders, and that they know a lot about sustainability, they know a lot about environmentalism, and they have this whole culture and knowledge that they really can do. And when the guests come, they're not just taught it in a classroom, but they actually were going out with the Indigenous survivors and like engaging in these acts, taking part in the customs, and so involve their body and their minds, which really, and we know that getting to know people is the first step to having those shifts. So the key factors for the Indigenous authentic tourism model was that the communities really need to have a final say in the entire process. They all need to be in agreement. If they do have to have a relationship with outsiders, the people who transport them there, they really need to be the ones kind of running that, not meeting the needs of other people. And they need to have clear outlines for visitors. They're not allowed on this land because it's like environmentally not sustainable, or it's religion, it's kind of like their spiritual land. So they need to decide where people can go and not go. It also should be sustainable and follow environmental guidelines, and not just be a quick cash scheme, but a real long-term social benefits for the community. It should be accurate and empowering ads, and the images should be controlled by the Indigenous people. It also should be really authentic and, again, not made touristy. And all of these recommendations came from the World Tourism Organization. And the goal was that the tourism can benefit the communities, empower them, increase economic opportunities, and present more favorable representation with positive exchange for guests. That really becomes a way to challenge negative stereotypes and to teach people about the real ways of Indigenous knowledge, not just what's been put in the media. And I think it can bring people separated back together. It's a really small step, but I think it's really powerful because it really confronts a lot of the negative stuff that I see that my clients have to go through. That's it. Okay, I'm gonna see if I can get out of this PowerPoint now and come back to you. Okay, there we go. That's everything.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Does anyone have any questions?
Oh, I have to put the chat on.
A few of our fellow students mentioned how great it is that Canada and Australia and other communities can learn from one another. So that's really exciting.
Did somebody ask something? I didn't hear it. Oh, and one student said that Canada was way ahead. I think Canada's ahead in some ways, but I think Australia is really ahead with research. That's what I have learned when doing like my master's therapy program and stuff. They're ahead in research. I don't know if they're so far ahead like on the ground doing things, but I could tell at least the research was pretty far ahead. How expenses I don't know that, how it is around the world. No, I just know really Canada.
Patricia, I have a question. Do you know off the top of your head about a tourism operation in Canada or Australia that you've researched that's you think is doing a really good job that you could just maybe share a little bit about?
The other case study that I didn't touch on here was in Jasper National Park, so Banff, that area. And what they're doing is the tour operators and the Indigenous communities in the area are working with the management at Jasper National Park to make things more authentic, because they had kind of, our national parks has a really bad history. They moved people off the land for the parks. So they're trying to bring the ceremonies back, and they've created like advisory committees. They're making a point of hiring Indigenous people, and a lot of the communities have come back into the park. But of an actual operation, I don't know. This is pretty new to me.
That's so interesting. It's really cool to see how that progresses.
Yeah.
Aurora is asking, how do you think Indigenous tourism experiences can be marketed as learning experiences?
I think what I read about in Australia was that they were having people come to the community, and they were taking them out and like actually showing them like how they cooked, and they were participating in sweats, and they were participating in a lot of the customs, and they were teaching them like how to do things in the community. So they were actually learning. So I saw that as the kind of the model that you'd be building out of. how to pick medicines, things like that. They were all doing that.
That's wonderful. Thank you. You have a few more moments left on your time. Are there any last remarks you'd like to share? Anything that really jumped out at you? Something that's excited you the most about your research?
I just really loved the idea that they were the ones in charge and they were the ones teaching, because so often it's, you know, the white social workers going to their community, the white psychologists, like it's not the other way around. So I just thought that that was so powerful, that the people that had colonized them, like, and the people that kind of were now on the receiving end and kind of learning back. So that's what I really, really loved. And that's what really struck me about it. It's just so empowering. And it's just such a, it's so like visual. So I really loved that, because to me, I have learned so much from them as a social worker when they teach about the different kinds of customs and traditions. Like my clients find that so healing, and I have truly found it healing. And so I feel like they have, like we all want to do meditation, mindfulness, sustainable. I feel like they've been the knowledge keepers of that all along, and we're just discovering it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to Patricia for her presentation, some really interesting research. Before we move on to our next, if we were in a real room, we would all give you a round of applause. So know that we are all sending that your way. Before we start our next presenter, I just want to remind people of two things. First, if you're not speaking, please mute yourself. Second, if you want to, there's a way that you can just view the speaker. It's cool to see everyone in the room, but we want to put the speaker front and center. If you go to the top right hand of your Zoom screen, there's a view button and you can choose gallery view or presenter view, speaker view rather. So that's a good way to have the speaker front and center. So next up, we have Amanda Kendall. And Amanda is a travel addict and the host of the Thoughtful Travel podcast, which is now in its 6th year, covering topics like responsible travel, ethical tourism, supporting locals when they travel, and the many lessons that travel teaches us. And Amanda is going to be presenting on her project called Elephants Are Many Shades of Gray, Ethical Wildlife Tourism. So Amanda, if you're ready, we can get, one more thing, sorry. If you need transcription, subtitles while people are talking, on the bottom right hand of your screen, there is a little 3 dots that says more, and you can click there and click show subtitle, and you'll be able to see subtitles as people are speaking. So Amanda, over to you.
Thank you, Jody. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, I've got my own wildlife in the background here. I've got a cat who's just yelling at me, so I apologize if you can hear her as well. Let me share my screen. Oh, here we go. And Vincey's just messaged me to say that I now have extra time, which is very dangerous because I really like to talk, so this could be a bit of a problem. Now, play. All right, brilliant. So thanks, Jody, for the introduction. And yes, I run a podcast called the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. So I talk to lots and lots of people about lots and lots of travel issues. And what I've learned most over the past 5.5 years is that everything about being a thoughtful traveler is pretty grey. And so when I was doing the pilot program and we got to the session about wildlife tourism, I was so interested to hear the presenters talk about and the lecturers talk about the issue of elephant tourism, because I had learnt over my years of running the podcast that it was a very black and white issue. And the simple thing is, don't ride animals, don't do anything that's, don't ride elephants, don't do anything that's not a natural behavior for them, full stop. And as I listened to the, I think it was Daniel and Sarah discussing this issue, I realized that it was much more grey than that. And I thought, okay, well, this is an interesting thing to dive into. So what I really want to talk about today is, I mean, I'm going to talk about elephants, but really what I want to, what I'm really trying to say is that we need to stop and think about everything and not make assumptions, and just realize that every kind of, well, probably every issue has these nuances and shades of grey. So my capstone project itself actually focused mostly on the situation in Thailand, but I know that some of you will have already listened to it, and I made a podcast episode rather than something written. So I know some of you already listened to it, so I don't really want to repeat all of that. And so what I've got is something a little bit different. And if you haven't listened to the podcast episode, then feel free. So it's actually episode 252, and you can find the Thoughtful Travel podcast anywhere that you listen to podcasts. So I am still going to briefly summarize some of what I talked about on there and what I learned, and then I'm actually going to dive a little deeper into a different continent, into Zambia. And I included this short story about Zambia in my podcast, but on reflection, I realized that's this tiny story, but it's actually a really good example of how many shades of grey there are in ethical wildlife tourism. So yeah, that's me. So let's get on. Now, also, I just have to say, I was really disturbed when I looked at these slides again tonight. I made them with this elephant who looks so brown, and I've got the elephants in many shades of grey, to the point where I Googled, are elephants really grey? And they're like, yes, Google says yes, it just depends what soil they're around, and that's why he looks brown. So that bothered me for a while. So I just want to cover some things we learned about in the pilot project, in the pilot program, as well as what I talked about in my podcast episode, because obviously in Thailand, elephants are a very important part of the culture and the economy. And the use of elephants in Thailand has evolved significantly this century, well, over the past century, I suppose. So for many decades, they were used in logging because elephants are really good at it. So apparently better than many kinds of machinery and stuff to get into the particular forests in Thailand where, like in the rainy season especially, it's difficult to remove logs using other methods. Elephants, unfortunately for them, were very good at it, and so they were used for many decades. There were many thousands of elephants being used, being employed essentially to work in the logging industry. But as you can probably guess, that's not a very pleasant way for an elephant to live. Hard work, lots of injury, just not nice. And of course, to be trained to do that work, they had to go through the crush and to be broken, which is a horrifying, horrid, really cruel procedure. So in 1989, logging was elephants were banned from being used in logging. So this was a good thing. And of course, back, I don't know, a few months back, I thought, oh, that's simple. That's really a good thing. That's easy. But it wasn't that simple, as it turns out. So at that time, the Thai Elephant Conservation Centre was established, and they tried to find ways to deal with all these unemployed elephants, because there were suddenly thousands of elephants who had no work to do, but they still needed to be taken care of. Elephants eat like up to 200 kilograms of food a day, which is crazy. Estimated cost to keep an elephant going up to $80 a day. And, obviously that's a huge amount. So the Elephant Conservation Centre tried to find ways to kind of repurpose, I suppose, the elephants. And unfortunately, some of the things they did were turn to the tourism industry and offered rides to tourists, and also other things like training elephants to paint or to play musical instruments and those kinds of things, which we now recognise are not a natural behaviour and not a very pleasant thing for an elephant to do. So the riding continued and does continue in some places today, but of course over time many people realised that riding an elephant was not an okay thing to do as in general. And in 2015, a lot of tour companies, for example, Intrepid Travel and so on, they deleted rides from their tours. And so that, of course, was a great thing. And I had thought, oh, that's just a fantastic decision. That's, straightforward and simple. But of course, it's not that simple, because then the same problem arises. We've got all these elephants and they need to be taken care of. So what do we do? Now a lot of elephants are in sanctuaries, but there are very varied standards. Some of them still are doing activities that are not natural for elephants. It's very, if you're going to go to a sanctuary, do a lot of research first is my shortcut there. The biggest problem is elephants live a long time. They can live like up to 60 years. So it's not a short-term fix. There's thousands of elephants there, and we need to figure out and help there to be ways to deal with them best. So I learned about this, the 4 views of wildlife tourism from Joan Ben-Trupa-Boima, and all the references are in my podcast episode show notes if you want to have a look. But I thought this was a really useful structure to think about how animals are used in tourism. And I'm going to relate these to Zambia in a moment, I promise. So first of all, there's the dominionistic, so animals are under the control of humans. And that's, of course, that under the control of humans was back in the logging days. That was a really good example of completely under the control of humans and, do what we say. Utilitarian, that could also be the logging days, but also benefits like, the tourists like riding them, and so that's a benefit to us. So some of the typical tourism, the tourist activities are covered there as well. And then if we move on a bit, hopefully we start to recognise the moralistic idea. So the rights of the animals are equally important as the needs of wildlife tourists. So this is probably when we stop riding them, but I think what we would like to be aiming for is the protectionistic. So actually finding ways in which tourism can help species conservation and preservation of animals, whichever they are. So let me turn to Zambia. So I used this little clip from a friend of mine in my podcast, and I'm just going to play. It's a 2-minute story about a time not long before COVID when we could still travel a lot. And my friend Catherine was in Zambia. And although this photo looks a little bit like a statue, this was actually a real elephant right in front of her. Now, bear with me while I hit play, and let's just, let me check here if I'm sharing sound, share computer sound. Okay, so if you can't hear anything in the next few seconds, please yell.
When the lodge was built, the owners didn't realize that they had built it in between a river where a lot of elephants gather to drink and a wild mango tree. And every year in November, this mango tree fruits, and the elephants who've gathered to drink on the river have an incredible sense of smell, of course, and they immediately smell these mangoes, and elephants really love mangoes. And in fact, in this particular park, there are a lot of communities living on the edge of the park, and the elephants go and they raid the villages' mango trees. So the villagers don't like them so much. So it's actually preferable for them to eat the wild mangoes, and they're a real treat for them. So instead of going around the lodge, the elephants do what is quite instinctive for them. They follow their natural path from the river to the mango tree, and it just so happens to take them right through this lodge. Luckily, the reception area is open plan, so it's open on either side. But the elephants do have to climb up some steps, and they walk straight through past the reception desk and down the other side, and they stand just outside the lodge eating the mangoes and feasting on these mangoes. Anyway, I was lucky enough to see an elephant come through, and I stood behind the reception desk, and this elephant came past and he stuck his trunk over the reception desk. It was as if he was looking for a pen or something to sign the guest book. And then he walked over to me and he put his trunk over towards me as if he was sniffing me to see if I had any mangoes on me. And then he carried on and off he went. And he then stood outside feasting on these mangoes.
So I love that story of Catherine's, and I remember at the time when it happened thinking, oh my goodness, that's crazy, in a good way. And now I've come to reflect a lot more on this tiny incident, and I've kind of thought that there's actually parts of this story that fit into all of these views. So there's the dominionistic kind of part where the villagers, so you might recall Catherine said the villagers don't like the elephants coming into town. So this is one of those situations where, you know, civilization, urbanization, or at least a town has encroached on their territory, on the elephants' territory. So they're coming in to steal the mangoes. So the humans want to kind of control that and say, we don't want the elephants to eat our mangoes. So the wild mangoes, okay, that's okay, but not ours that we're cultivating. Also, I mean, the safety issue of the control, of being under the control, like I don't know the answer to this question, but I don't know what would happen at that lodge if an elephant was to like inflict an injury on a guest. You know, what would happen? Would they be shot or something? I have no clue, but you know, it's a question I would raise. The utilitarian part of it in that area. So I think obviously there's benefits to tourism because they take safaris in that area, and they like, you know, obviously tourists like to see the elephants. There's also the promotional benefit of showing that video, showing a video. There's videos of that lodge online showing the elephants walking through. You know, you might see these elephants if you come and stay at the lodge. So there's those benefits to attract tourists. The moralistic side of it, I thought, okay, so they decided they're not going to cut down this mango tree at the lodge because the elephants they're equally important, their rights. They have just as many rights to be there and eat the mangoes. Although I would also ask the question, if they have equal rights, should the lodge owners have done more research first? So they realize they wouldn't be, or so they would know they're building their lodge through the middle of the elephant's path and maybe change that. And then finally, there's an interesting extra aspect, which you didn't hear in the extract, of the protectionistic side of it. Catherine told me that at this lodge, it's quite a high-end lodge, and they have a range of jewelry that you can buy, elephant related, and it's, you know, sustainably and responsibly sourced. It's really pricey, and those proceeds are going to conservation projects. So there is that kind of view of it. So just from that one tiny experience, I thought there is all of this stuff going on, and it's hard to know. I mean, I still have a lot of questions on this one little situation, you know, so that's the kind of the shades of grey. Very vague, you know, very broadly speaking, the elephant-sized questions, I suppose, that I would ask if I was traveling and I was going to see elephants. Seeing them in the wild would be the absolute best way. But if you are, especially in Thailand, I think, back to Thailand, I believe these are the things to be looking for. Direct human contact should be infrequent or not at all. Are the elephants entertaining humans in some way? Even bathing elephants apparently causes distress and can cause skin issues and all sorts of stuff. In fact, one of the reasons that I started thinking about this whole issue was that Daniel Turner in the interview session 5 in the pilot program mentioned that actually riding the elephant may be less distressing for an elephant than things like walking with them or washing them, because their riding is, you know, they're much more, there's less distraction and less craziness going on around them. Also, riding. Are elephants ever ridden here? Don't go somewhere where they're riding elephants. That's my my quick summary, because I wanted to put that there. So there's heaps more information in the podcast, and I saw Vinci has shared the show notes and the links to that. So if you want to have a look or a listen, then I've got heaps more info in there. So I will stop sharing my screen and see, I have talked a lot, sorry. I've still got a couple of minutes, haven't I? So let me see. So many questions. Jody, have you been tracking these? Can I?
Lots of really interesting comments, and okay. People just, you know, interested in talking a bit about, you know, wait, there was one, I scrolled past it by accident, but there was a comment about
just comments, yeah,
you know, about how we define things. And I spent some time in Thailand with elephants, and when I was there, it was a black and white conversation. So it's really interesting to learn a bit more about the nuance from you about what is you know, all the other things to be thinking about, and you know, what about all the people involved, and how this is affecting their livelihood as well. Did you, when you were looking at the questions surrounding elephant treatment, what did you come across things about the communities or the people who own these elephants that can no longer make a living, and how that affects them? And are there any ways that tourist initiatives are trying to support those people?
Yeah, absolutely. Like that's another, you know, massive part of it, is that the mahouts who have been looking after their elephants, and sometimes are the owners and or the owners of the elephants, still need to make a living in a way that they can, you know, afford to support these elephants, because it's much more expensive to support an elephant than like a child, as it turns out. I can feed my kid on $80 a week, not $80 a day, so, or less. So yeah, that's a huge issue, and I can't tell you off the top of my head any good solutions that they found, but I think that goes back to working together properly with the local communities in a way that you know, provides them the opportunity to find solutions rather than them being imposed. You know, I did see some examples of them being, you know, some imposed solutions that didn't, you know, from external sources that didn't work out. But yeah, that's another whole aspect of it. I actually can't remember off the top of my head if I talk about that in the podcast episode, or it's just something I've been reading and working on elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you. Dana wants to know, do the elephants you mentioned in Zambia, the ones in the lodge, live in a protected wildlife area? If so, does that have an impact on how they're viewed in terms of tourism?
I would have to double check, but I think yes. I think they're in an area like one of those large conservation areas where they have security to prevent poaching and so on. And well, it's a good question, but what I will answer with is I had a chat for my podcast earlier in the year with a guy who was the caretaker of the last 2 northern white rhinos in Kenya, and he emphasized to me so strongly that the tourism was so essential for their survival. And during this COVID times, with you know, fewer tourists going to Kenya, it was a really, really massive issue just to be able to afford the security so that they could protect the animals from poachers. So I guess that, yeah, yes, Dana, that's the answer. That does have an impact on how they're viewed, but it's, I don't know, I don't have a good, clear answer for you.
Amanda, can you put the name of that lodge in the chat for people who want to learn more about it?
Absolutely. And
it looks like someone raised their hand. So I'm going to let you, why don't you go off mute and ask your question?
It's not a question, it's more of a comment. And I just wanted to say, like, you know, I think it's very much like a part of our, I guess, ethos of Rise Travel Institute to admit to not, you know, like we don't always have all the solutions. These are really complex issues, but that we continue to ask the right questions that center the marginalized voices, including animals, non-human animals. And so I just wanted to say I really appreciated your presentation and all the questions you continue to bring up and push around this issue.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like I've provided nearly no answers, but maybe that's the point, is that there are so many questions, and that's the important part.
I agree. The more complex the questions get, I feel like the more learning that happens. Does anyone else have any questions for Amanda? Or Amanda, do you have any last thoughts, comments?
No, just keep asking questions.
Thank you so much. We have another comment. Some of the non-riding elephant camps don't offer healthy lifestyle for the elephants because they are fed too much of unnatural stuff and they lack exercise. Even knowing these, one additional problem that elephant riding has is the image of humans dominating or controlling the animal, which may add to normalizing the idea that it's okay for humans to behave that way in general, which in turn may be harmful to wildlife conservation efforts. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think one of the things is that sometimes there are things which are less bad, but it's okay for them to be happening with, you know, the elephants who have been trained in certain ways. You know, you can't untrain them. You can't suddenly make them you know, their spirit unbroken and so on. But it's also important that we don't share pictures and videos and stories about those kind of situations. So because that then normalizes it in a way. With one picture of someone on an elephant doesn't explain the whole story behind it. So it's important not to share those, I think.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Amanda. That was a really interesting look at elephants and wildlife tourism. And we're going to move on to our next presenter. Aurora Christie Octavia is a postgraduate student, master's program in international tourism and hospitality management at Griffith University in Australia. And Aurora is going to be presenting her project called Taking Care of Indigenous Tourism, a lesson from the Burundi Tribe. So, Aurora, you're up.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I'm Aurora, and today I will present a lesson from Burundi Tribe about how to take care of indigenous tourism. So first, let me introduce you to Burundi Tribe. Baduy is an indigenous community that live in Banten province, Indonesia, and while located only 100 kilometers from Jakarta, the capital city of Indonesia, Baduy live as an isolated community, separating itself both from other community and technology development. While living in seclusion, Burundi Tribe was acknowledged by both local and central government of Indonesia, and Baduy's leader actually went to see the government once a year to discuss matters regarding their tribe. In recent years, Baduy experienced a huge flow of tourism. Their location, beautiful nature, and intact culture has made them attractive for travelers who looks for authentic experience. At first glance, Burundi Tribe looks like they have what's needed to be indigenous tourism provider. They have cultural system, they have government support, they have visitor demand. That's why it shocked tourism community when Burundi Tribe asked to be taken off tourism destination grid last year. Through a formal letter, Baduy's representative has explained their concern of COVID-19 pandemic, being offended by tourists, waste issues, and sacral rights ignorance that led to decision in closing off their village. Well, after a long discussion with local government, they agreed to open their area after pandemic has passed. This event still interesting to be discussed. Because why would Burundi Tribe refuse travelers? Hasn't their huge number of traveler visit bring great opportunity for them as underdeveloped community? I figure there is at least two big reasons that could explain this. First, unsustainable tourism program. By analyzing using the 5 domains of sustainability by Ben Eli, it has been clear how tourism activity in Burundi Tribe was unsustainable. For example, the material domain has been disturbed by the plastic waste issues, as tourists often left their waste in an inappropriate place. Tourism activity has also depleting Baduy's limited resource to provide traveler necessities. Tourism has also changed their economic domain by changing the job available in the area, and also how Burundi Tribe, especially the younger generation, has suffered from demonstration effect brought by fancy stuff traveler has and used within their area. Traveler was also holding different level of respect to nature. But we believe that preserving nature is equal to preserving life itself, thus incorporating various conservation efforts in their daily life. The tourist has ruined this Baduy's domain of life by lack of consideration to tribes' protected area. The social domain has also suffered, but we have complained that their language has started to deteriorate since the traveler didn't use the local language, while more and more Baduis need to learn this new language to communicate with tourists. The contradicting value tourists brought also led to various conflicts within the community between those who want to continue their culture and those who want to change. This conflict has also led several people to be expelled from the Baduy community. Cultural appropriation and value changes has also disturbed the spiritual domain of Baduis. Some of the tourists lack respect for Baduy ethics that different with our daily ethics, and being involved in cultural appropriation causing massive inconvenience to the Baduy community. Tourist demand of comfort and souvenir have also caused Baduy value to shift to materialism and culture commodification. The second issue was expectation gap. Baduy expect to share their indigenous wisdom to the traveler through the tourism activity that they allow in their territory. They also expect visitors to be a contributing learner by being involved in various works across the village instead of simply giving money that didn't mean much for them. Especially since Baduy did not see it's necessary for them to become a tourism destination and have a low desire to develop a tourism program. It's certainly different with the tourist expectation of their vacation in Baduy, as mostly the traveler motivation is to escape the hectic city life. They were quite content by being the bystander, enjoying the nature and cultures Baduy owns. They also expect the money they pay was enough to be the contribution to the Baduy community. This gap has made the disappointment and dissatisfaction on both sides. These two issues need to be addressed immediately before snowballing into a much bigger issue. To attend this issue, I would like to recommend several actions. First, proper tourism planning and management. Baduy might have been reckless before by simply open up their area and hoping for the best. Current situation should have made them realize how messy tourism could be. Baduy could no longer welcome the tourists as the free-rein guests who free doing anything they want. In the current pandemic situation, they could use the time to develop proper tourism planning and management. They could start by put limitation on visitor number, develop visitor regulation, redevelop their tourism activity, and limit areas for tourism. All of this planning need to adhere to Baduy's desire and capacity for managing tourism. In this matter, Baduy needs a louder voice than the local government, travel agents, and visitors to decide what kind of tourism activity they will allow in their territory. Baduy also needs to embrace travel agent and mass media to assist them in building appropriate brand marketing. Instead of continue marketing Baduy as simply a scenery viewing destination, they could project the image of learning village to the tourists. With this effort, Baduy can adjust the expectation of the traveler and target the specified tourists. Finding the right tourists that fit their criteria will definitely reduce the impact left by the tourists. It's also doable for them since Baduy didn't particularly expect a bigger, significant number of visitors in their village. Last but not least, it's important for Baduys to start making effort of bridging the gap. They could start develop educational material that inform tourists on how the community works, since properly educated tourists will be able to act accordingly and pose a minimal disruption to the Baduy community. By having the necessary information, tourists will also adjust their expectation of the experience and enjoy it properly. Baduy could also start teaching their indigenous language to the tourists to restrict the use of other language in their area. This is the reference that I use. And Baduy request to be taken off the tourist circuit in mid-2020 has become a noticeable warning of issues revolving tourism activity in the indigenous community. The main issues were unsustainable program and the expectation gap between community and tourists. These issues were not exclusive to Baduy community. Less recognizable indigenous community may also experience similar things when they were opening themselves to tourism activity. It is then recommended that the indigenous destination use this pausing moment of the pandemic to change their tourism program. I would like to finish my presentation with one of my own tribe traditional wisdom. Di mana tanah dipijak, di situ langit dijunjung. It roughly translates to on the land we stand, its sky we lifted up. It means whoever we are, we should live as how the initial community lived, hold up their value, and follow their culture. I think if as traveler we hold on this, we could help indigenous community goes through tourism development more safely. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Aurora. That was really interesting. While other attendees put their questions in the chat, I have a question that I always think about when I read about suggestions for how we can change and do better. How would you go about supporting the community in making these changes? Like, how do you help them?
It's necessary to start with discussion actually, especially within the travel agents. If I may share a bit, indigenous tourism is something new in Indonesia. It's just been held like a few years back. So actually people don't know what to expect and how to approach this kind of tourism. So I think if there is a discussion between this tourism provider, especially the travel agent, it will help them so much because especially the Badwis, they already have, I think they already have enough resource to do the tourism activity as they want, but they just didn't know how to proceed with that. So yeah, I think the discussion and education will be a main part of this development.
Interesting. Another question I have for you is, do you know of any communities that are doing or like are succeeding with this? Or do you know where travelers could go to find information if they want to take a trip that is responsible for the community? If you don't know off the top of your head, you can think about it and maybe put it in the chat, but I find it's hard as a traveler to, there's so much information and the world is so big, it's hard as a traveler to figure out how to plan a trip and have those interactions that are meaningful and responsible. So if you have any resources you want to share, that would be really appreciated. While you're thinking about that, Dana is wondering, do you know what the Burundi Tribe originally had seen as the benefits of tourism? Like,
Yeah,
why did they do
okay,
it in the first place?
I'll answer your question first. So I don't think there is a community that already works on that, but there are communities that works on community-led tourism. They focus on the village tourism, so not literally the indigenous, but the village, the rural tourism. I could share on you on that, and also about the benefits they see, but we actually see themselves as the one who understand and connect with the nature. So their initial benefit that they expect from tourism is they educating other people who already didn't have any connectivity to nature. So they want to educate the others on how you should respect nature and how you should repair your relationship with the mother nature. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there are travelers that goes to this village with that kind of perspective. So that's where it messes up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Alyssa, one of our instructors mentioned that you did a really good job of breaking down different pillars. There was another question. Where did it go? Sorry. Here it is. Tracy is wondering, are you or anyone else doing any work to implement the recommendations?
as I say, there is no community work on indigenous tourism yet, but for the community, for the village tourism, there are a lot of startup and NGOs that work on that. They start making discussion, they start accompany these villagers to develop their programs to be less harmful for them. So yeah, I think that will be the starting journey for us Indonesians to start taking care of our indigenous tourism.
Thank you. Anyone else? This is all making me really excited to start traveling again once it's safer to do so. So now I have so many firsthand resources of people to ask when I'm ready to plan a trip to Indonesia or any of these other places. If no one else has any last questions, Aurora, if you have any last thoughts or comments you'd like to share before we move on.
Yeah, I think I just want to restate what my last motto, di mana kaki dipijak, di situ langit dijunjung. I think it's really important for us as travelers to not just thinking about ourselves when going to this new destination, especially for if the destination is in community that usually that has been closed off for centuries. Thank you.
Thank you. We do actually have one last question from Joe. Take it away, Joe.
Thank you. Great presentation. This is more of an open-ended question that to just as you've closed this presentation. I think this is really, really interesting looking at the planning, the marketing, and thinking about the gaps, because I think all of us here, I think, have a lot of different roles, whether it be international education administrators, different operators, providers. With that in mind, I think it's really important for us to think about how we bring in these local communities as we build programs. As many of you know, there's a rise in custom programs and making programs very specific with very specific needs. And I guess something I'm kind of wondering, speaking out loud, and I think for all of us to think about as Study Abroad builds back, is how much and how often are we bringing those local communities, local nonprofits, guides, how much are we bringing them into our customization process? Because in my experience, I've worked a lot with the US partners and people here in the United States to make sure I'm delivering what they need. But I think the conversation has been a little bit less about what I've been speaking to the local communities or the local nonprofits. So just more of an open-ended question. I don't think there needs to be any answer here, but just something for all of us to chew on and for this to let marinate. I'm curious to see where and how this conversation goes. So thank you, Aurora.
Yep, let's just continue listening to others.
Thank you so much. So we're now going to turn it over to our next speaker. Kelsey Frankel is a program manager at the Center for Responsible Travel, or CREST, where she provides support for a wide range of research and consulting projects, manages CREST's internship program, and oversees their academic affiliates program. And Kelsey will be presenting on Researchers as Travelers, Exploring Research Tourism Through an Anti-Oppression Lens. So Kelsey, take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. Can you see me and hear me okay? I don't know if you can see me, actually. Jody, can you guys see me and hear me?
Yes, we can see you.
Yes, you're good.
Oh, awesome. Okay. It's not showing me myself, so I wasn't sure. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have two screens here, so just want to make sure I'm doing the right one. One second. Okay. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, it looks good.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about what I call just broadly research tourism. And this is a topic that I got really interested in after doing a few different field research projects in Indonesia, actually. So this ties in well with Aurora's presentation and other places as well, and just things that I got thinking about as I was doing those projects. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that today and my experience and exploring research tourism through an anti-oppression lens. And I just wanted to mention that unless otherwise noted, all of the photos are from the Canvas stock gallery. And I have all of my citations and photo credits separate in my notes if anyone is interested in seeing those. I also wanted to say off the bat that because we're exploring this through an anti-oppression lens, we're inherently taking a critical lens to this topic. But I do want to say that the information in this presentation isn't meant to shame research travelers or universities. I have been one. This is a really complex topic, and I think that the impacts are only just beginning to come to light as more tourism research is being done. As I said, many of us, including myself, have taken part in this system for our own personal and academic gain, and I think that's important to recognize. And only by challenging this system that allows us the immense privilege of traveling for research can we begin to mitigate the negative impacts we might have on a destination or community and ensure that our research does more good than harm, because that is the whole point. So just going through what I'm going to talk about today, going into the definition, the scope, what are some of the benefits of research tourism, also talking about the threats and ethical implications. Then I'll go through a case study, my own experience, and some solutions. So defining research tourism, there isn't a ton of research about this out in the world, but I did find one really helpful book about the topic, and they were calling it scientific tourism. And according to this book, there are three main types of scientific tourism. And that can be NGOs, government agencies, or university academics traveling for research, development, projects of that type. And these are some of the activities that they talk about. So exploratory visits to determine feasibility for further research, meetings, travel related to securing funding, supervision of fieldwork, doctoral, postdoctoral, professorial research internships. So these are all of the type of things that we're talking about today. And I think it's a really important topic because it kind of gets lost in the literature. We don't really think about this type of travel and the impacts that it might have, which is why I wanted to think about it a little bit deeper. My presentation specifically is going to focus on university academics. So this third bullet point here. And not because there's a strict delineation between this type and the other types. There's actually a lot of overlap. But I wanted to just think about one portion of this so that we could start to understand the scope and apply potential solutions to the university setting. So I'll talk more about that under solutions. I also wanted to note that I do think that research tourism and what we're talking about today is different from what we call citizen science or volunteer ecotourism, because I think in that category, those travelers typically don't have a lot of experience in the field and might be traveling for a much different purpose. And I think we need to define and provide a scope around research tourism, so professional researchers, because the way that they travel and their intentions when they travel, what you might call their psychographics, are probably much different than your citizen scientist or your volunteer tourist, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. So there is a type of tourism that's been coined called save tourism that I wanted to mention, and it encompasses the different interrelated disciplines listed here. So what I'm calling research tourism exists loosely at the intersection between scientific tourism and academic tourism. However, as I said, there are many overlaps and similarities between all of the disciplines. and there's no strict boundaries between any of them. I'm not proposing coining a new term, but simply exploring one facet of a large, not well understood type of tourism. So this is the scope that I'm talking about today. University staff, professors, graduate students, postgraduate students, fellows, undergraduate students, doing domestic and international travel for research associated with a university. I wanted to attempt to think a little bit about the scope of this because there isn't a lot of research being done on this. And obviously what I've done isn't anything scientific or large scale, but I was thinking about ways that we could illustrate, okay, how big is research tourism? And so I looked up how many research universities there are in the US, and this is a classification done by the Carnegie Classification of Institutions of Higher Education. But as an illustration, there are 266 research universities in the United States. And just think about if all of these research universities sent just 50 staff members, graduate students, undergraduate students abroad in 1 year for research, that would already be 13,000 travelers. And obviously, research universities aren't the only universities that send people abroad for research. So this is a vast underestimate. And this is only thinking about the United States as well. Think about all of the other countries in the world too. In a study conducted at just one university in the United States, staff had touched all continents for their research except Antarctica. The most trips were taken to France, Canada, China, Germany, India, England, and Italy. So like any type of tourism, research tourism has its benefits. And I've listed here some of those benefits alongside the domains of sustainability that we learned about from a systems perspective in our course. So when done well, when managed well and developed well, research tourism may bring awareness to local conservation efforts, offer capacity building or employment opportunities for the local community, contribute to science by answering a research question, provide an educational and meaningful experience for the traveler, and provide an opportunity for cultural exchange. Some of the threats, so again, like any type of tourism, there are threats associated with this as well that we need to be cognizant of. When managed poorly, research tourism may also contribute to global emissions, foster dependency by the community that's being visited, contribute to economic leakage, contribute to colonial attitudes of Western superiority and marginalization of the global South. And this is something we talked about in our volunteer tourism section. Create social friction, overutilize resources such as water, energy, and materials that may be scarce in the destination, and threaten wildlife directly and indirectly. Let's see. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that I think there are some interesting psychographics when it comes to research travel that we need to consider when thinking about the impacts that they might have. So these are different features that an academic or research traveler may have, not in all cases, but sometimes, that I think may affect if and how they impact a destination. So one thing to think about is that in some instances, they may be traveling alone or without the structure of a tour operator. So think about all of the planning and development and hopefully good ethics that go into planning a tour operation or a tourist site. Not all research travelers would be traveling with a tour operator or to a developed site simply by the nature of their research. So I think that's something we have to think about when we're thinking about the impacts that these travelers may have. By nature of their research, they may also need to access spaces and places not available to your typical tourist or without the infrastructure to support tourism. So depending on what they're researching, it could be cultural heritage, they could be accessing spiritual or sacred sites that are not typically open to your typical tourist, and because they're going with, you know, the clout of university behind them, they may be able to access those spaces. So what does that mean for a place that might not be developed for tourism? And finally, depending on the university that they're coming from or the country that they're studying, they may only need to comply with human research standards, so human research standards of ethics, if their research deals with human subjects. And this is something I experienced in my own background. Having done primate conservation research, a lot of my colleagues traveling in the field to do behavioral or ecological research having to do with primates wouldn't need to comply with human research standards because their research didn't have to do with human subjects. So there weren't really any ethical guidelines that they could follow. And I think this probably happens more often than we think. So I did want to mention some of the field research protocols that do exist. And I'm sorry for that fashion sticker in the corner. I think that's from my Canva template. But protocols for field research are usually developed by the university and are largely health and safety focused, at least in my initial research that I was doing. There are a lot of international, federal, and state guidelines and regulations. So these are just some of a few that I've listed. But as I've said, the guidelines are numerous for health-related studies, but are lacking for social sciences more generally. And I think that's a problem. So some ethical questions that I want us to raise as we're thinking about research travel. And this is a quote from the book that I read about this topic, and a woman who was traveling as a volunteer, but also she was doing an ethnographic study. And she says, my official positions then were ethnographer, volunteer tourist, and journalist. I ignored the tourist label. I was above the negative connotations and impacts of tourism. My motivations were academic, passionate, and activist oriented, naive or otherwise. I was out to help save the world. So I think this is a mindset that we have to be cognizant of and critical of. So some ethical questions. Do academics have a responsibility to mitigate negative impacts and contribute to positive impacts on a destination when they travel? Do academics have a responsibility to the communities they might impact, even if their research is not human related? Do academics have special status to access places and spaces normal tourists should not? Are academics by their nature less likely to negatively impact a destination or a community than a normal tourist? Another quote from the book I read: the scientist is supposedly a self-sacrificing champion of a universally beneficial project, while the tourist is an egocentric individual driven by a desire for self-gain. The first is supposedly lowly paid for his patient striving, while the second is a compulsive consumer. Such figures are not meant to meet either physically or in social science publications, and if by chance they do cross paths in the same elsewhere, the scientist looks the other way as if distracted. So this is a case study research that I did in Java, Indonesia at a primate conservation site. I interviewed all of the volunteers that were there and also reviewed their monthly reports. And we had a mixture of Western and also Indonesian volunteers. The volunteer house was located in an extremely rural mountain agricultural community that was predominantly Islamic. I think that there are some ethical considerations to think about. The researchers and volunteers had access to a rural Islamic community that they likely would not have visited as a normal traveler. And in fact, walking around the downtown and nearby areas, everyone knew where we were coming from as a white person because we were the only white people in the area. It was very obvious to everyone that we were part of this project because there weren't a lot of us. There were also significant social and language barriers between the volunteers and community members. The volunteers were not required to learn the language. Obviously, there were positive impacts on wildlife conservation. We supported the largest grouping of wild Javanese lorises in the world. Positive impacts on the personal growth of volunteers and interpersonal relationships. However, the volunteers and trackers reported that there were perceptions of wealth and power dynamics that led to social jealousy and conflict. And there were also some health and safety issues that I think could have been mitigated if the program was a little bit better developed. And we really thought about these volunteers and researchers as tourists and thought about the impacts that they might have while they were there. So some solutions, I think we need to better define and understand the scope of research tourism, and some sources of possible data could be universities, go to the countries themselves and ask about the number of research visas that have been permitted, conservation and development sites, so the number of researchers present there. Universities should also strengthen their criteria used when deciding whether to grant travel, and not just assume that granting travel is always the answer. Universities should strengthen pre-trip planning protocols, such as cultural sensitivity training, environmental mitigations and offsets, and preference to support locally owned businesses, development of international sustainability guidelines for university researchers conducting fieldwork, and universities should strengthen their sustainable partnerships with conservation and development research sites run by local organizations. And I think that's all. Sorry that I went a little bit over. Any questions from anyone?
Thank you so much. This is really interesting. Two comments that I wanted to point out. Carrie, like myself, said she hasn't spent a lot of time thinking about this term research tourism before. And a lot of it seems to tie in really well to Dr. Anu's book, Beyond Guilt Trips, which is one of the books that we read during the program. And Aurora mentioned that it's really interesting and true that a researcher can go to places and communities that other tourists don't have access to, and they could have a bigger risk on damaging those communities that tourists don't have. And I think that's really interesting. Dana wants to know, do researchers generally obtain permission to be in certain communities? And are those communities involved in making those decisions about the research projects and the terms of their impacts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a wide range. There's some really well-developed projects that are long-term, that communities were involved in making decisions. But there's also short-term projects that are being done that maybe don't have all of that development behind it. So I think we have to, and as I was saying, depending on what the research is for, so in my experience doing primate conservation research, impacts on communities weren't always thought about because we were thinking so heavily about, primate conservation, impacts on wildlife, impacts on their habitat. So I think that's the main issue that I wanted to explore.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is a topic that I'm definitely going to think more about in the future. And it's interesting to remember that you don't have to be on vacation to have an impact, good or bad, as you move through the world. So something we should think about whenever leaving home. As always, everyone, we encourage you to connect with our presenters on LinkedIn. Suzanne has been sharing their LinkedIn profiles so that we can all continue these really important conversations. And we're going to move on to our next presentation. Thank you so much, Kelsey.
Thank you, Jody.
So next up, as Destination International's Education and Certification Manager, Taylor Ruoff assists with the development, management, and administration of educational and certification programs for tourism professionals. And her project is on, she'll be presenting Arctic tourism in Nunavut, Canada, challenges and opportunities for sustainable tourism development. So, Taylor, are you ready to go?
Yes, let me just share my screen. thanks for the intro. All right, can everybody see the slides?
Yes.
And hear me? Okay, great. So hi everyone, my name is Taylor and my capstone project is on the challenges and opportunities for sustainable tourism development in Nunavut, Canada. And I picked this topic because I had the incredible opportunity to travel throughout Nunavut back in August for about 2 weeks. It was an amazing experience and it was super memorable because it was my very first Arctic tourism trip. So a very new experience for me. So I want to give you a brief overview of what I'll include in my presentation. I'll start off with a bit of background on Arctic tourism and then give you a profile of Nunavut so I can set some context for my research. Then I'm going to dive into 5 key challenges and opportunities for sustainable tourism in Nunavut, many of which can be applied to other Arctic tourism destinations throughout the world. And then finally, I'll reflect on whether or not sustainable travel is even possible in the Arctic due to the ongoing threats of climate change, which I see as the biggest challenge for sustainable tourism in Nunavut. I do want to note here that all of the photos that you'll see in my presentation were actually either taken by me or my partner, Jake, during our travels in Nunavut. So it was pretty fun to compile this presentation and reflect on my trip. So before we jump in, I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page about what the geographic area of the Arctic actually is. It includes the most northernmost areas of the world. Starting at the North Pole, it spreads far south and wide until you hit the tree line, which in Canada is around the 66th parallel or the line of latitude around the Earth. So what does Arctic tourism actually entail? Arctic tourism occurs in remote high latitude areas with fragile and extreme environments that are very difficult to access. It involves traveling really long distances to view and experience unique physical and marine landscapes, iconic wildlife, and cultural sites. And visitation levels in the Arctic vary widely across the region. Here are a few examples of Arctic tourism activities. When I was in Nunavut, I participated in a lot of wildlife viewing. I got to see polar bears, muskox, Arctic foxes and hares, lemmings, beluga whales, and caribou. Also, I did a lot of kayaking around sea ice and small icebergs, ATVing, and hiking through diverse taiga and tundra terrain. To travel to different locations across the territory, we flew in helicopters and took other small aircraft and boats. So visitation levels to the Arctic are actually relatively low compared to other destinations, but the area is receiving unprecedented attention and interest and pre-pandemic rapid growth. Why? One of the main reasons for this is the concept of last chance tourism, which is the phenomenon of when tourists travel to places that are specifically at critical risk of permanently disappearing due to climate change. In other words, it's the fear of missing out before it's gone forever. This is personally what drove my decision to visit the Arctic in Nunavut. It felt to me like a once in a lifetime experience or a bucket list trip. And I didn't know if I would ever have the opportunity to go again because of the significant impacts of climate change on the destination. So now I'll give you a little bit of an overview about Nunavut. And for those of you who are not familiar, map of Canada, so you can see that Nunavut is a territory located in the northeastern part of the country. It is the largest by total area, northernmost and easternmost territory in Canada. It's also the least populous, so it's extremely rural. There are 3 territories in Canada and 10 provinces. Nunavut encompasses the majority of the Canadian Arctic archipelago, and it's actually supported a continuous Indigenous population for over 4,000 years. Today, about 85% of the population is actually Inuit, which is the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Nunavut means our land in the Inuit language, and Inuit means people. So Nunavut is actually Canada's newest territory. It was only established back in 1999 when the Northwest Territories were formally divided into two to create a homeland specifically for the Inuit. The creation of Nunavut was the outcome of the largest Aboriginal land claims agreement between the Canadian government and the Inuit. Also, it's really important to note here that Nunavut's communities are only accessible by air or sea because there are no roads that connect between or to southern Canada, which is obviously a major issue for tourism in Nunavut. I won't go into too much detail here, but here are some important statistics on tourism in Nunavut. It's been gradually increasing in the area in recent years, but mining, oil and natural resource extraction, fishing and hunting are its largest industries. Most visitors that come to Nunavut are locals visiting families and relatives. For the international visitors, most are coming to participate in fishing, but other popular activities include wildlife viewing and bird watching, camping, and hunting. Tourism is highly seasonal in Nunavut, and anywhere in the Arctic, obviously, because of the drastic changes in temperature over the year, going from lows in the -40 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter to highs in the 50s Fahrenheit in the summer. So the tourism season typically occurs from about May to September because of this. I've listed some of the top attractions and destinations in Nunavut on the slide. I actually stayed along Cunningham Inlet and Somerset Island on my trip, which is where most of the pictures are from in the presentation. So throughout my trip, I couldn't help but think of how sustainable my activities and travels actually were, and if it was even possible for Arctic tourism to be sustainable at all, given these challenges and the unique aspects of the region. So I wanted to better understand if tourism in the Canadian Arctic is more beneficial, if it's actually raising awareness of climate change, promoting conservation of the environment, preservation of cultural heritage, or if it's more harmful, if it's just further exacerbating biodiversity loss and the degradation of the highly vulnerable landscape and wildlife of the Arctic region. So to do this, I used the Sustainability Laboratory's 5 fundamental domains of sustainability framework that we learned about in our very first session in the pilot program. So I attempted to assess some of the key challenges and opportunities for sustainable tourism in Nunavut based on lessons throughout the RISE pilot program, additional online secondary research. I looked at academic journals, news articles, the government of Nunavut's plans, policies, regulations, reports, and other sources, and also used my own observations as a tourist in Nunavut. So first, I'll start off with the material domain, or the basis for regulating the flow of resources and energy. I found that one of the most critical challenges in Nunavut is limiting transportation-related carbon emissions. Traveling around Nunavut is not easy. It takes a lot of time, money, and resources to be able to do so, and you can only go by air or sea. The accessibility of Arctic tourism in general is one of its greatest challenges, since you have to travel far distances to extreme and remote areas to participate. So on my less than 14-day trip, I took about 8 flights to travel to and within the territory. And that was actually less than most everybody else on my trip. And I can't even count how many times we drove on the different ATVs and the Unimogs throughout Somerset Island as well, which also contributed to carbon emissions. So according to the government of Nunavut, the largest GHG emitting sector is transportation for them. It contributes to about 66% of all emissions in the territory, which equated to over 385,000 tons of carbon dioxide in 2017 alone. So through my research, I saw an opportunity to mitigate the carbon footprint of traveling Nunavut by encouraging the higher use of lower emission transport options. So kayaking, canoeing, hiking, biking, and also utilizing renewable or green energy alternatives when at all possible. This would only be possible with regional support and funding incentives by local government authorities. Specifically, I could see them doing this to support tour operators to upgrade to cleaner and more efficient vehicles, aircrafts, and boats, and would be extremely beneficial for the local environment. For the economic domain, my research indicated that ensuring that visitor spending stayed within the local economy and the retention of a skilled tourism labor workforce are big issues in Nunavut, and they're actually very related issues as well. These were noted as prominent challenges in Nunavut's most recent annual tourism report and were specifically called out there. There is an absence of a suitable labor pool in Nunavut that is actually interested in and trained in the different elements of the tourism sector. And therefore, it's had to historically rely on importing foreign workers, which means that not all of the tourism dollars that are coming into Nunavut are staying in the local economy. Turnover is also quite high for a variety of reasons. One of those is the seasonality of tourism in Nunavut itself. So an opportunity to increase retention and local employment in Nunavut's tourism sector is for the public sector to expand its training offerings and to create incentives to retain employees in the sector. The government currently provides trainings in hospitality and business skills. They do on-the-land guiding, cruise expedition team training, survival and risk management skills, and cultural interpretation skills. But these are not currently offered consistently or very often, and the participation levels aren't very high. So improving access to these trainings, especially now, post-pandemic, offering these both in person and online and hybrid formats, as well as just improving access in general to professional development and education to locals, and incentivizing them to participate in these trainings and actually be hired and stay in the workforce would be beneficial to help this challenge. For the domain of life, my research and observations pointed to challenges in minimizing the hunting and exploitation of animals by visitors in Nunavut. While there are many iconic species in the Arctic, many of these are threatened or endangered. In Nunavut in particular, hunting is a large part of the Inuit culture, and it's something that I observed that the locals take a lot of pride in as well. The local government does have a wildlife management division, which creates and manages laws and regulations to protect the wildlife populations in Nunavut. And non-residents are required to use a licensed outfitter and be accompanied by a professional guide when they are hunting. But it was really unclear to me in my research how well these policies are actually enforced and communicated to visitors, other than if they were searching for them on their own online. It was also unclear if all tour operators that offer wildlife excursions have to have certain certifications to be able to do so, even though there are a variety of guidelines that the local government puts out in place for doing this. So there's definitely an opportunity to better educate visitors of these guidelines and regulations and issues so that awareness can be increased. And also guides and operators need to be trained on best practices and regulations in the wildlife management space and how to properly communicate those with their customers. For the social domain, I found that using tourism to support and uplift the local culture is an ongoing challenge. While the Arctic has gained popularity worldwide as a tourism and wildlife watching destination, which is mostly what I focused on in my presentation so far, the region has always been vital to the identity, culture, and survival of its Indigenous people. So there's an opportunity here for the tourism sector to support the development of Indigenous products and experiences, as long as this is done by and in collaboration with the Inuit. One area in particular noted by Tourism Nunavut as a place to expand on this is in Indigenous arts and crafts, which is currently a thriving and vibrant space for their communities. There are some initiatives and funding opportunities currently offered by local government authorities to support Inuit product development, but access and awareness of these programs definitely needs to be improved so people actually use them. It's also critical that this product development be led by the Inuit or in participation with the Inuit communities to ensure authenticity, respect, and enrich the tourist experience. Increasing Inuit participation in tourism, should they choose to share their cultural heritage, would help to increase the capacity of the local tourism workforce as well, going back to the economic domain. And finally, the spiritual domain, which is the basis for a universal code of ethics for traveling. I found from my own experience that visitors, me, especially those from abroad, may not be aware of the sensitive political and environmental factors that are unique to Nunavut before, during, or even after their travels. So before I arrived in Nunavut, I was not aware that the vast majority of the local population is Indigenous, and I did not realize how much the territory depends on mining and the extraction of natural resources to sustain its economy, which really impacts the political atmosphere. An opportunity here is for tour operators to better inform travelers of the local customs and environment before they even arrive in the destination. So the territory, I could see like the territory setting up some sort of set of resources to share with visitors before their arrival. This would be like a baseline set of information that they would provide to all operators, which they could then expand on or customize based off of their destination, the activities they offer on their trip, and also to set a baseline for responsible visitor behavior guidelines that visitors must sign off on so that they actually know them before they arrive in the destination. So wrapping up here, this is by no means an exhaustive list of the challenges and opportunities for sustainable tourism development in Nunavut. But from my research and travels, I really found myself especially reflecting on the following questions and discussion prompts from the session on climate change in the pilot program, since climate change impacts all of the challenges and opportunities I just described. So basically, can we only understand climate change if we see its impacts firsthand? So did I actually have to be in the Arctic to understand the significant impact climate change is having in the region? And do we need to fly to the other side of the world to become global-minded citizens? So were my travels to and within the Arctic actually more detrimental or beneficial to the region? Average temperatures in the Arctic are rising almost twice as fast as the rest of the world, and much faster than previously predicted. This is changing the Arctic ecosystem in profound ways, especially with the rapid melting of sea ice, which most Arctic wildlife depends on in some way. Therefore, I don't think that Arctic tourism can ever be fully sustainable. The extreme climate and vulnerable environment, combined with the lack of accessibility, high costs, and need to travel far distances, is always going to be a challenge for the sustainability of Arctic tourism. But when developed and managed responsibly, tourism really can be a force for good, raising awareness of the importance of conservation and preservation, and positively support these local communities and their ways of life. So kind of summarize my opinion here. According to the World Wildlife Fund's 10 Arctic tourism principles, when tourists learn about communities and the environment, tourism provides the most benefits for all concerned and does the least damage. Knowledge and a positive experience enable tourists to act as ambassadors for Arctic environmental protection. So that is it for my presentation. Thanks everyone for listening in, and I welcome your thoughts and any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Taylor. There were a few great comments. Thanking you for your analysis. Amanda mentioned that she wonders how we can change people's thinking without having to have firsthand experience. And Dana wants to know, Do you know how involved the Inuit are in decision-making about the tourism that occurs in their territory? And did you have the opportunity to talk with any members of the community about the tourism in their area? And if so, what did they share with you?
Okay, these are both great questions. So I'll start with Amanda's first. You know, there are ways of getting people to, you know, understand these impacts without actually having to be there, though obviously having like that personal experience and connection can make a really big difference. The tour operator I went through actually also helps in producing a lot of different documentaries and videos and informational resources on the impacts of climate change and all the different wildlife in the Arctic itself. So they document those experiences and share those out publicly with others. So you don't have to be there, but you can virtually, you know, or you can watch a documentary about it to learn about it as well. And I feel like, especially during the pandemic, the power of powerful documentaries, or the power of documentaries, can be quite powerful and actually make people's decisions change. That's just one example I have. And then for Dana, you know, that's a great question. I believe that the majority of the local government is run by Inuit. So they're involved in every single decision that is made, since they, again, are like about 85% of the local population. One or two of the guides and the tour operator I went through were Inuit. So we got to talk to them about their experiences living in Nunavut their whole lives, and about kind of how things have changed over the last couple of decades or so. You know, mentioning that more people are coming here, but obviously with the pandemic, things have changed greatly, and we were one of the first people to be able to go back. So things are only going to change even more now.
Thank you so much, Taylor. This was a really interesting and eye-opening presentation. We're going to turn it over to our next presenter. Eva Mossberg is a leader, innovator, and adventuresome expert in the field of sustainable tourism. She's the North America Community Lead and Partner Coordinator for the Adventure Travel Trade Association and the Senior Manager of Strategic Partnerships here at Rise Travel Institute. And Eva will be sharing her presentation titled The Ethics of Travel, Weighing the Pros and Cons of the Tourism Industry. So with that, over to you.
Hello, everybody. First off, I just want to say I'm super inspired by all of the other presentations that I've heard today. So very honored and feel really good about being in the space with you. So as Jody said, I'm going to present my screen. Oh, hold on, let me just do one thing first. Share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. I was waiting for that, but wait, now they can't hear me either. So I am going to be talking about the ethics of tourism, which was the topic of my capstone. I think we often, this is a topic that's come up, I feel, more and more recently with flight shaming and, all these various organizations bringing up the bad end of tourism. And I'll be examining the history of travel and tourism, and then review sort of the good and the bad, and see how we can actually make it a force for good. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm using tourism as leisure tourism, and travel is more indicative of an act that's less voluntary. So people who move because of displacement due to war and atrocities and emigration and such things. So when I say tourism, it's leisure tourism. So I'm going to start with the evolution of travel and tourism. We have been traveling, for as long as we've been on this planet, according to all the artifacts and proof of just movement of people since the beginning of time. So archaeological evidence and artifacts. So this is nothing new. And then, so the next step, we traveled, and we still do. Some people still travel for survival, to gather food, to change pastures for animals, and to trade goods. And during the age of discovery that we talked about in the pilot program as well, it's a period during the 15th through the 18th century. People primarily from the European countries also began to travel to grow economically and to expand their political power. So motivated by power and greed is usually not a good thing. They usually don't lead to much good. The age of discovery was plagued by colonialism, and it's a term that National Geographic has defined as control by one power over a dependent area or people. It occurs when one nation subjugates another, conquering its population and exploiting it, often while forcing its own language and cultural values upon people. So we can see how easily this leads to power struggles, right? One people come in and they impose their language and their habits onto the people who live in the destination where they arrive. And, this is still ongoing. I feel like there's often our Western values that are heralded as the best values, whereas they may not at all apply to or fit in with other local cultures, and they often don't. I was going to check the chat here. That was not for me. So back to the colonial times, we had, the empires were built. We had the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and nations such as Great Britain, France, Holland, Portugal, and Spain. They invaded and imposed their values on ways of life on areas located primarily in Africa and Caribbean. And many of them are still dependent on their colonial history, and they're sort of, what they inherited or what they were imposed on. Much of that is weaved into their local cultures. And even if they're now sovereign, much of that is still in the culture. You can see, for example, with food and language, if you go to the Caribbean, there's some French-speaking areas, even though they're independent countries, they still have that, the heritage from back in the colonial days. During this time also, the white male was established by themselves as superior to other cultures and people. And it's a notion that's still present in many, if not most parts of the world, as I said, where the Western values and the power of the white male is at the center of that circle of power that we also explored, where the white male's in the middle. And then, you can add attributes that belong to you. If you're female, then that puts you a little bit more outside of the circle. And if you are any other color than white, if you have a different religion that doesn't fit in with a white male, then that puts you further and further out of the power. So even though some, in some places we have had, we've had cases where the system has been challenged and overturned. We can talk about the official end of slavery and apartheid, but just because officially it's been, it's been abandoned, that doesn't mean that that a change in policy is not enough to change prejudice, social norms, or common practices, as history has shown time and time again. So in the 19th century, with the advent of the luxury ocean-going steamliners, cars and trains, leisure travel became a pastime for the wealthy, who crossed Asia on the Orient Express and the Atlantic Ocean on the Titanic and other similar fancy ocean liners. And for anyone who's ever been to Liverpool, England, it's palpable, the massive economic impact that this industry had on that region and others as well. And then later on, of course, commercial flights and charter companies paved the way for people traveling for leisure en masse, as we can see here. It's easy to see that the global environment and modes have changed over time, but the similarities are still there, some of them anyway. People are still motivated to travel for many of the same reasons: leisure, business, warfare, and to escape oppression and unsafe living situations. And the unfair power play established in colonial times is still very much of everyday life. For example, the working conditions of a foreign worker in many instances are still rooted in that seesaw codependent power struggle, which can be said to have begun with colonialism. So now moving forward, I will focus on voluntary travel, so leisure travel. So I will just call it tourism. So now I can go to the next slide. There it is. So the dark side of tourism, at its very worst, it resembles colonialism. The white wealthy man travels to a developing country of non-white ethnicities where he engages in behavior made possible by the inequity of power and money and that long instilled notion that Western values hold more esteem than non-Western values. The people in the destination hosting the traveler, which we often refer to as the host country or host country or the host destination, rely on providing services to the traveler for their livelihood, and thereby they cater to their needs, even if it goes against the local customs or depletes local resources. So as a result, indigenous peoples and locals, they often conform to the standards and principle of others, which dilutes their own culture. It is a complicated power struggle, one that has evolved over centuries of time and is made worse by the fact that oftentimes the more the host community caters to the visitor's need, the greater their personal financial gains. So the more they cater to a visitor, even though it means depleting their own culture and resources, the more money they make, which is of course a motivator in some of these developing nations. Two of the most revolting and harrowing examples of this is of course the sex trade and the poaching of exotic animals, where children and animals who really have no voice are used to fulfill the illegal desires of travelers. Foreign owned, and I'm going to move on here to this number 5. Foreign owned investment in regions that have low living standards, so-called developing areas. Again, here we're putting the Western values on and classifying a developing nation. I always ask, developing into what? What is the end goal of a developing nation, and is that good or bad? Anyway, it may appear helpful to a local economy that lacks capital for infrastructure, when in fact it's another example of the wealthy using the resources of developing areas for their own good. So it can be argued, of course, that foreign investment creates opportunities for the local economy, but it also asserts and maintains the notion that the white wealthy man is superior. In addition, although it might seem like a great thing, oh, I'm building this hotel in this developing nation, out of every $100 that's spent by a tourist in a developing country, only $5 stay in the local economy. And this act of money leaving the host country and ending up elsewhere, it's called as leakage, economic leakage in tourism. And tourism has also negative consequences on the environment. Global warming caused by carbon emissions, reef bleaching caused by sunscreen products, pollution and disruption of waterways by cruise ships, leading to displacement of marine life, erosion and disturbance of wildlife and their natural habitats by overcrowded parks. The list goes on. Socioeconomic impact of global tourism. So tourism has a tremendous impact. There's no doubt about that on the global environment and also a vast spectrum of stakeholders, from travelers, employees, and business owners to people, animals, local environments, and resources in the host destination. The World Tourism and Travel Council reported in 2019 that almost 1 in 11 jobs globally were in the tourism industry. In the following year, because of COVID and the mobility restrictions, 62 million jobs in the global tourism sector were reported lost. And I think all of us in this room can relate to this, if not personally affected. Definitely, I know in my circle, people who have, and myself, lost jobs, new opportunities like Rice Travel Institute, but I don't know anybody who's not been impacted. the pandemic has given us an idea of just how much tourism contributes to the global economy, and also how severely and unevenly it impacts the local communities in every corner of the world, because not every place is affected equally. Tourism makes up between 39 and 69% of the GDP in the Caribbean, but only 8.5 and 8.6% in the US. It's easy to imagine the devastating impacts of limiting tourism in these heavily dependent regions. So to conclude, there is no denying that the tourism industry have both positive and negative impact. Some argue that tourism does more harm than good. However, I do believe that tourism is ripe with opportunity to be a force for good. And this has been quoted many, many times. I still think it holds so true, the whole part of it. I used to just hear the first sentence: travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. That's all I used to hear. But then the rest of this, I think, holds even more value. Many people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one's little corner of the earth in all one's lifetime. It was said so well, and it rings so true in so many ways. But I do believe that travel allows people to learn, to exchange ideas, and to broaden our minds. In addition, as we talked about, economies around the world depend on tourism for survival. Tourism really is a resource in the livelihood of many, in particular in what, again, the Western culture has named developing areas. And there's no lack of information nor misinformation for the curious and concerned. But I do think that there are two challenges that we have, or the one challenge is twofold. It's getting the right information to the right people and getting more people educated in the impact of their actions. So I'm going to just conclude with some practical recommendations for how to make travel sustainable and a force for good. And this doesn't only apply to when you travel. I apply this to my daily life because I do feel everywhere that we interact with people, we have this responsibility to be mindful and respectful of local people and customs. And again, it can be outside your front door, or it can be halfway around the world. Beware of your own privilege and prejudice. Travel slowly. Immerse yourself deeply in your destination and allow yourself to become a part of the way locals live. Go to the local coffee shop instead of going to where all the tourists go. Support locally owned businesses that employ sustainable practices. I think this is super important here as well. I live in a little seaside town north of Boston on the east coast of the US. And everyone's talking about shopping local, and they all talk the talk. And then they all go and shop at Walmart or one of these big chains where they can get things for cheap and they can get everything in one place. Whereas we have these beautiful, cute little shops that are owned by the people who live here. So support locally owned businesses. Photograph with care and intention. Consider multiple perspectives as it's an opportunity to learn more about your subjects, and moreover, just learning more about where they came from and a bigger story. Consider animal welfare. Are the animals treated well and performing natural functions that are natural to them? Do they have access to adequate food, water, and shelter? And are you intruding on their natural habitat? Apply the 7 principles of leave no trace. If you aren't familiar with the 7 principles of leave no trace, I recommend you look it up. And then also lastly, participate in a carbon removal and storage program that's offered by Tomorrow's Air. And I put the link in there as well. I'll put it in the chat. And that concludes my stop. Hold on.
Thank you so much, Eva. That was so interesting. A really great way to summarize all of the reasons that we need to be mindful and respectful when we travel, and with a historical perspective, which is my personal favorite.
Well, and I also think we talk about sustainability and DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, as if they're 2 separate issues. They're really not. Sustainability cannot be sustainable without the DEI. Now they're discussed as 2 separate topics, which I think is a mistake.
That's so true. Thank you. Dana has a question. Did you examine the ethical issues raised when people travel to countries with long and ongoing histories of human rights abuses or exploitation of non-human animals? How should these considerations be thought about in terms of tourism?
Let me read that question again. Well, it's interesting because I really think, we can do a lot as individuals, but when you're talking about countries that have long and ongoing histories of human rights abuses and exploitation and of humans and non-humans, I do think, yes, of course, we can vote with our dollars and not go, but I do think the tourism boards of these destinations have a lot of work to do in this area as well. So it's really, one part is educating the consumer, but it's also another part to educate the people who really hold the strings to the economic setup and the tourism industry as a whole in that destination. So I think targeting tourism boards and DMOs, people who promote the destination, there are two ends of it.
Thank you. If there are no other questions currently, I'd like to say thank you so much to Eva. As always, if you think of a question later, or if you just want to further the conversation, Eva's LinkedIn link is in the chat, and we encourage you to reach out and continue the conversation. Eva is our last presenter of the morning session. Thank you so much to all of the presenters who gave us a lot of things to think about when it comes to travel and traveling responsibly. We are going to take a break, just under 2 hours. We're gonna come together again. Thank you, Eva, for the link to tomorrow's air. It's a really interesting initiative. We're gonna come back at 2 o'clock Eastern time, which is just shy of 2 hours. And we will have some more really interesting presentations. So you can stay online. We're gonna end the recording and then start it up again. Or you can sign back in later with the same link. We'll have some more presentations. We encourage you to come back because we still have some more speakers with interesting things to say, with really incredible projects. And we'll also be sharing some announcements and things to know about RISE at the end. So with that, we'll sign off, and we'll see you back here in just a little bit.